This is Laura Vanderkam. I'm a mother of 5, an author, journalist, and speaker.
And this is Sarah Hart-Unger. I'm a mother of 3, a practicing physician, and blogger on the side. We are 2 working parents who love our careers and our families.
Welcome to Best of Both Worlds. Here we talk about how real women manage work, family, and time for fun. From figuring out childcare to mapping out long-term career goals, we want you to get the most out of life. Welcome to Best of Both Worlds. This is Laura. This is episode 260, which is first airing in late July of 2022. I am interviewing Mary Laura Philpott, who is the author of Bomb Shelter, which is a new memoir that is out this summer. She is also the author of the memoir, I Miss You When I Blink, which I know a lot of our listeners have read and enjoyed. Her book, Bomb Shelter, was selected for the Modern Mrs. Darcy Summer Book Club, or Summer Reading Guide, I guess. So I know that a lot of people have come to know Mary Laura's work through that. So we are excited to talk with her, talk about what, Bomb Shelter is about, what her writing process is like, lots of great things that we talked about. So speaking of summer reading, Sarah, how is your summer reading going?
My summer reading is going really, really well. I hit a big reading slump this year around March, April. And then I think I wrote I'm having a comeback at the end of April, and my reading has come back and I'm super happy about it. I just finished my 6th book in June, which is for me a little bit higher than my normal rate of finishing books. I think I read 2 nonfiction and 4 novels. Actually, I guess one of them was a memoir because one of them was Mary Laura Philpott's I Miss You When I Blink, which I really liked. It was super cute. So I'm very excited. I haven't heard this episode yet, so I'll be dying to listen to it. And I've been writing down what I read every day on this little list, which has been kind of motivating for me. And I have been making good use of my Kindle, which I dug out of obscurity in a drawer, and it's still charged and worked. And I've been using the Libby app. So kind of a good flow going.
That's awesome. Yeah. And the reason you had been somewhat resistant to digital reading, but I think you had mentioned it just opened up some time to read that was not available otherwise.
Yes. Specifically, I usually have to lie down in Genevieve's bed for about 30 minutes every night while she listens to her Headspace sleep story and falls asleep. And I can read during that whole time. And then usually that reading momentum kind of carries me and I want to read further. Whereas otherwise I would have just been angrily scrolling and waiting for her to fall asleep. And then by the time that was done, I wouldn't have energy to read. So this is working much, much better. I actually tend to use my phone with the Kindle app in her bed just because it's easier. And then I transition to the digital Kindle because it's just easy that way. Oh, and I want to mention my current reading, which was recommended by our Patreon people. We had a book month. That was May. And someone recommended the American Royal series by Catherine McGee, which is about, it's an alternative world where the U.S. executive branch is actually a monarchy descended from the Washington family. And it's so juicy and cute and fun. And I'm enjoying it.
Just interesting because I didn't think Washington had any kids. So
this is a completely alternative reality.
It's
everything is different. There are elements of history that are real mixed in, but it's as if, it's an alternate world.
Okay. Sounds great.
And things seem to be going well. So maybe that should have been.
Well, that's the royalist streak here on Best of Both Worlds. Who knew?
Just kidding.
Yeah. I don't know if I've been reading some. I read the book Under the Whispering Door by T.J. Klune, I want to say his name is. That was a very different sort of book. But I guess some people had recommended it as kind of a feel-good sort of book in a way that I found a little bit annoying because it required changing, I think, a fundamental rule that had not been introduced as a possibility kind of earlier. And within science fiction, that's a little bit, a no-no. I don't know, but it was necessary to make it a happy ending. But I was like, well, I would have taken the sad ending. I was prepared for that. But anyway, it's a very fun read and certainly goes quickly. So people might enjoy that if they're looking for something a little different. I also just finished These Precious Days by Patchett, which is relevant to this episode because Mary Laura makes a cameo in there. She's not referred to as Mary Laura Philpott. It's just Mary Laura when Ann Patchett is talking about Parnassus, which is her bookstore that she owns in Nashville. And Mary Laura worked there in marketing for many years before becoming a full-time memoirist. So that is kind of funny to read that and realize what Mary Laura they are talking about. So I just finished that and enjoyed that. But yeah, summer's been a bit of a whirlwind so far, but with a lot of travel. But as we're recording this in late July, things should have hopefully settled down a bit for me. So maybe I'll get some more reading in. Always looking for more ideas. So please feel free to send them in and send in your listener requests too, because Mary Laura, although I had wanted to interview her as well, I've met her a few times and find her wonderful. But the specific nudge was that it was a listener request to somebody who loved her book and wanted to hear from her. So we were happy to bring her on. So please keep the listener requests coming. We would love to make as many of those happen as possible. Sarah and I do not know everyone, nor do we have the ability to convince everyone to come on this show. But, for some people, sometimes they're willing to give it a whirl. So let's hear from Mary Laura.
Well, Sarah and I are delighted to welcome Mary Laura Philpott to the show. So, Mary Laura, can you introduce yourself to our listeners?
Hello. Thank you so much for having me, Laura. This is really fun. I'm Mary Laura Philpott. I'm a writer. I wrote most recently Bomb Shelter, Love, Time, and Other Explosives, which is a memoir. And before that, memoir and essay, sort of a little further down the essay end of the spectrum than the memoir end of the spectrum, called I Miss You When I Blink.
Wonderful. And you have 2 children as well who are...
Yes, I have teenagers. Bless my soul. I have right now a 16-year-old and a 19-year-old, and I am fully in the throes of that. People always say each year, there are certain phases of life where everything's the same for a few years. And then there are phases where every passing year or even half year is like a whole new era. And I am fully there. Every 6 months, it's like, whoa, we're learning all new things about human development.
Yes, that's true. Well, the ages of 16 to 19 are known for that. Is your older child home for the summer? We're recording this in summer, coming into summer break here.
He's actually not. So he finished a year of college and was home long enough to dump all his laundry all over the floor and wash it and then pack it all back up. And he is a camp counselor in the summer out on the coast. So that's his favorite thing in the world. So he got home, left again, and I won't see him all summer.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, that's probably a good way to spend the summer. And your career has taken quite a winding journey. For anyone who has read your books, and particularly I Miss You When I Blink, you did a lot of different things. I mean, it was...
Yes.
I'm just going to try and remember here. Software consultant coming out of college. That's sort of an unexpected one.
That's what my parents said also.
Yes, exactly. A stay-at-home mom for a while, a bookstore marketer, a cartoonist, public television host.
Yes.
And professional memoirist. So maybe you can sort of connect the dots.
Well,
in that.
When you say them like that, I'm like, that does sound like a really eclectic career collection, but there were things all kind of stringing those things together, except for software consultant at the beginning. That is something I did.
You needed something to do coming out of college.
I did. I was an English major and I've always been a writer my whole life. I was a strong writer in college, but I didn't know what to do with that. I didn't want to be a novelist. I've never wanted to write fiction. I didn't want to go into journalism, and I didn't want to be an English professor. So I didn't want to go to grad school in English. And that left me thinking, well, I guess there's no real way to use this English degree. And I briefly toyed with the idea of law school. I did apply to law school, but then I pulled out at the last second. Software consulting is that's the company. Accenture was the company that was on campus doing interviews of seniors at the time I had this, identity crisis. So they were there. And I just walked up and was like, can you interview me? And as one does in a moment of identity crisis, I just did the best possible job I could at imitating someone they might want. And I did it maybe a little too well. And I ended up working for Accenture for a few years. I did meet wonderful people. It is a great company. I got a really good business education, I think, out of it. But I was never meant to be a software developer. I mean, that just is not what I was meant to do. And so I left. But from there, I did corporate communications for quite a while. So I worked in healthcare specifically. I worked for a hospital doing marketing communications, website copy, newsletters, that kind of thing. And then kind of worked my way up through that world and ended up working for the home office of the American Cancer Society. That was my last full-time, in an office gig. And I loved that job. I love that organization. And what I was doing when I was working in corporate communications was storytelling. I was telling the stories of these organizations. I was telling the stories of people who had been served by these organizations. So early on in my career, that was like mid-20s through late 20s, I was writing professionally and I was storytelling professionally. So I was honing those skills that I would end up using later. Once I had kids and I sort of went back and forth from I'm just home with these babies to no, I'm freelance writing. But when I was freelance writing, I was speech writing. I was doing a lot of ghost writing, op-eds and things like that would come out under other people's names. So I never stopped writing and I never stopped developing my skills for writing within the essay format or within the, a short nonfiction piece of writing that is compelling and that tells a story and that gets you somewhere in 2,000 words. That's always kind of been my favorite structure. And the bookstore job came along when we moved. My family moved from Atlanta to Nashville. Nashville had this great bookstore. I was in there shopping all the time anyway. And, I struck up a conversation at one point with the owners and said, I want to subscribe to your newsletter, your blog, your social media. And they were like, well, we don't really have that.
We don't have one.
Right. And in that, in that way that I do, I was like, well, I'll do it. And the next thing I know, I had a job. And I did that for 7 years, 6 years, several years. I did that until I Miss You and I Blink came out. And then I was touring for that book and it was just too much. But kind of along with the bookstore job concurrently came hosting a show about books on Nashville Public Television. Those jobs weren't technically connected, but the people at NPT had seen my work at the store and for the blog. And they were like, hey, if we can teach you to be on camera, could you come talk about books over here? So it's all storytelling. It's all reading, writing, writing about life. It's more connected than it perhaps looks on the surface.
Yeah, well, it's a nice eclectic mix, which people who have read your books know that is often their format, that it's, these 2,000 word vignettes on related, but, sometimes slightly different sequential topics. But it's interesting. You said you were moving to Nashville. One of the fascinating things is that it was more for you that you guys moved to Nashville than your husband, even though the sort of normal story is like, oh, well, mom's sort of been in and out of the workforce or, freelancing for a bit. And the husband has the sort of set job and they move for that.
Right.
But that's not what happened at all for you guys.
Right. Normally you follow the primary wage earner who has the health insurance. not
People
the
often
writer.
Do. Yes, exactly.
Not the writer. But the beautiful thing about what my husband does, which don't ask me to describe it because I can't really, I know it's something financial, is that it can happen in different cities. And he's always worked closely with the entrepreneurial world, which is booming in Nashville and has been booming in Nashville for the past decade. So when I reached a point back when we lived in Atlanta and we had kind of elementary, middle school age kids, and I had kind of hit a burnout point where the children were old enough to have lots of things to do all over town, but they couldn't drive themselves. So I was living that chauffeur life in a city that has experienced a lot of sprawl. So I was sitting in traffic for most of my waking hours. I had tried to find meaning in my daily existence through, in addition to my freelance work, I was trying to do things like volunteer at school. And maybe that would make me feel more connected to, the reason I'm in traffic all day. It wasn't working. I was not loving my daily existence. I felt disconnected from it. I felt like I was spending a lot of time doing things I didn't really want to be doing. I wanted to be more attached to a creative community, and I wasn't finding that in Atlanta. So yeah, I was the one who ended up finding somewhere else I wanted to live and kind of saying to the rest of the family, hey, could you guys come along with me? So I feel very, very lucky that worked out and that my spouse had the kind of job that he could do somewhere else.
Yeah, always good when you can move the family unit. And of course, the bookstore, for those listening, is Parnassus Books in Nashville. It's a very famous bookstore for those who haven't heard of it, but probably many people have. It's a lovely bookstore there. So Mary Laura was working there. So we're going to take a quick ad break and we'll be back to hear more about her latest book, which is Bomb Shelter. So So I am back talking with Mary Laura Philpott about her life and writing, her career, her family. And she writes a lot about her family life. So tell us a little bit about Bomb Shelter and how that came to be.
Yeah, I will. It's interesting that you say I write a lot about family life because I'm still sort of getting used to accepting that identity. I resisted writing about family for a long time, partly out of a concern for my family's privacy. I'm a super, super private person, even more so on behalf of the people I love. And partly out of, I think, a little bit of pride. Like when you are a woman and you write about family, as you know, there are people out there who dismiss your work because, oh, it's domestic. This is lady work. It's not real writing. And I think I had a little bit of a chip on my shoulder about that for a while. But the more I wrote about what it feels like to be a human being, which is just a complicated, difficult thing sometimes, the more I found myself kind of needing to write about family because family is so much a part of my life. And if you write about the dynamics in a family, you are writing about the human experience, so much about what it means to be, a thinking, feeling soul trapped in a mortal body can be expressed by writing about being a family member trapped in a family. So that's a long way of getting to Bomb Shelter. Bomb Shelter is a book that would have probably happened in some way, regardless of what was going on in my life. I was starting to write a few years ago about what it feels like to be middle-aged, how things are changing at this point in life. My parents are getting older. My kids are getting older. My body is getting older. A lot of things are destabilizing. And I was beginning to write some pieces about that and kind of wondering, where are these going to go? And they probably would have gone somewhere sort of similar. But then something happened that kind of kicked everything I was thinking about into a different, more urgent gear. And that is that one morning when my son, my oldest of my two teenagers, was in 10th grade, my husband and I woke up at 4 a.m. to a loud thump. And it was the sound of his body hitting the bathroom floor. He had gotten up to get a glass of water. And when we found him on the floor, he was having a seizure. And so I tell the story in Bomb Shelter of calling 911, that day in the hospital, this kind of before and after day where this was the moment where nothing would ever be the same in our family. And the book is not a memoir of the epilepsy journey. It's not a memoir about my son or my relationship to my son. In fact, those events kind of weave their way through and thread their way through the story periodically, but they're not the bulk of the book. But writing about that experience allowed me to write in a more emotionally vivid way about how it feels to wish that you could keep everybody alive and okay just by loving them hard enough, but knowing you can't. So how do you get up every day and find meaning and positivity and even humor? How do we keep going when we can't fix everything with love? That's what Bomb Shelter is about.
Exactly. And I think, as listeners are sort of thinking about this question, we've had parents of kids with special needs on and things like that. But there's something about taking care of smaller kids with chronic medical conditions that's more under your control, right? Like you can make a small kid go to doctor's appointments. You can make them take their medicine. You can make them do whatever sort of lifestyle thing they need to do. But with your, teenage son, you're dealing with the fact that okay, he's not supposed to drink alcohol with this medication. It's hard enough to get your kids not to do stuff like that. And right. Here you are, having the medical thing to worry about with it, or that, he needs to take his medication. Adolescents forget to put their underwear in the hamper. And yet here you are, needing him to take something so that he doesn't pass out on the floor somewhere. So, right. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that aspect of somebody who you're trying to launch off into the world, but you have to also, do the caretaking at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah. For a second there, I thought you were going to say they forget to put their underwear on. And I was like,
they might do that as well. I mean,
they forget it all. Honestly, the health crisis part of this phase of life and the health crisis part of this book highlighted and really brought into clear focus some things that I think are actually true about parenting adolescents in general. I could have written Bomb Shelter without the epilepsy because adolescence, and it's different in every family. It's different for every kid. But in our family, it kind of started off very gently. Like I remember when my kids were 13 and 15 and people saying, oh, teenage years are so hard. And I was like, are they? I mean, I love my teenagers. They're so much more interesting than little bitty kids. Like we can have really good conversations. And then they learned how to drive. And it was like, this is amazing. I love having teenagers. But for me, the hardest part of raising teenagers has come the closer they get to leaving the nest and the closer they get to independence. And I think it's for the reasons that you just said. There's no longer this sense of, okay, you are a cog in the wheel of this family unit that lives in this house. And we all do these things. We all go to bed at this time. We all eat dinner at the same time, whatever. They have to go out and learn how to do things on their own. And the only way to learn is to try. And when you try something new, you will fail. So now we're in this phase of life where it's like, I'm watching them go out and do things and make mistakes and make choices that maybe I wouldn't have made or probably would have made at that age, but wouldn't make now. And there's a whole new powerlessness in this phase of parenting, health emergency or not. It's just a whole new thing. To me, this is harder than parenting toddlers.
Yeah, no, it's very different. I mean, I would say since I have teenagers and toddlers simultaneously, I would say I was up, big chunks of the night with the toddler he had a fever and it was just not good. But, then I still have to get up and get the teenager to school. So parenting is fun sometimes.
It's all hard.
It's all hard. So let's talk about your writing a little bit, about how you work. Like, what does your day-to-day writing practice look like? I mean, I'm looking at the Mary Laura Philpott nook in the house, where I suppose the magic may happen, or maybe not. I don't know. But maybe you can talk about that.
Yeah, it kind of varies by season. So listeners should know that Laura is looking at me in what I call my office. It's really just a dead end in a hallway that no one else is using. And I put a desk in here and I put a chair in here. And now it is my Zoom studio. But this is not actually where I end up doing most of my work, because often when I am working, everyone is home. Like Bomb Shelter, I wrote a lot of that during the pandemic. Truly, everyone was home and could not leave because we were on lockdown. So I will take any space I can get. I will work on the back porch if that's the quietest place. I will work in the kitchen if everyone else is in their rooms and this hallway has gotten too loud. I'll take the hallway. I'll go sit in the car if I have to. I'll take any space I can get. But if I am in the phase of work where I am writing, which is most of the time, I'm in a phase right now where I'm not as much. This is like a book promotional phase. I'm like getting off planes and stuff, and it's weird and different. But when I'm writing, I'm definitely smarter in the morning. I am not one of those people who can be like, all right, 10 p.m., time to sit down and write. I'm useless by 10 p.m. So I get up, get everybody, whoever's up and around, make sure they're fed. They go do their thing. And once I have a little bit of quiet, I write and write and write and think and erase and delete and do the things I'm doing in whatever document I'm doing things in until lunchtime-ish, maybe early afternoon. And that is when that part of my brain starts to get tired. And I just can't use it for much more than about half a day. But a practice that I started when I was working on Bomb Shelter that I think was really helpful, honestly, to the book, I think it made the book better, but also was just really enjoyable and neat for me, was using the afternoon time, which is still work day. At least when I have teenagers who don't need me for anything in the afternoon. If I've done all my email and everything else I need to do, I've got this work time, but my brain can't write. Using that time to read with a pencil in my hand, read anything, read biographies, read thrillers, read romance, read poetry, read literally just from the bookshelf of stuff I already have, but I also did shop sometimes, and highlight what other writers do well, and highlight lines and structures and pieces of dialogue that make me go, ooh, this makes me think about something I could do at some point, and kind of use that like class time, so that when my brain can't be actively producing, it can at least be sort of passively absorbing things that make me better at my job. So that's kind of how I broke up my workday when I was writing this book.
That's a cool thing to do. And I'm curious, I mean, first, how you wind up choosing essay topics. I mean, is it that, you get an epiphany like that, I must write about this. You try out different things and see where it's going. I mean, maybe you could talk a little bit about how you know if something is going to sustain the 2,000 words.
Yeah. So if I'm writing a standalone piece, like if I'm writing an essay that is not part of a book or that I don't think is going to be part of a book, and I'm hoping to pitch it somewhere, send it to the Atlantic or the New York Times or whatever, often I'm drawn to whatever that essay is about. And I write about just regular life. I don't write about like politics and news and that kind of thing. But often I'm drawn to write about whatever that thing is that's going on in my life because I can't stop thinking about it. It's almost like the topics of my essays demand to be written. And the only way I can get them to leave me alone is if I sit down and start writing and taking apart, okay, why am I obsessed with whatever, the turtle in my backyard? Why can't I stop thinking about that? Well, it's making me think about this. It's making me think about this. And I start pulling in emotional threads that maybe are more universal that don't have to do with just my life. Almost always, it's because something just won't leave me alone. And that's the case for essays that go into books as well, except that often those essays have something in common. So I'll write about, here's something I can't stop thinking about. It's this thing that happened, and I'm going to tell you what happened or what I learned from it. And then, a week later, I'll realize I have more to say on that thing I learned because something else happened that also taught me something about that. So now I'm going to go over here and tell this story. There's a thread kind of connecting things. And if I've written, like with Bomb Shelter, I got to a point where I had written a few essays and realized these are all about the same thing. These are all about this. Why can't we just keep everyone safe by loving them enough? And how do we go on once we realize that's the case? And so all the stories I was writing about were things that spoke to that question in some way. I mean, there's an essay in there about when I was in second grade, a girl in my neighborhood was kidnapped, like classic 80s, the thing we thought was happening all the time, but wasn't really, where a stranger breaks into your house and steals your child. And I've been obsessed with that story my whole life. I just never stopped thinking about it. And I took some time while I was writing Bomb Shelter to go, why can't I forget that story? Why am I obsessed with it? Why did it stick in my head, from the time I was 7 on? And it very much ties into what Bomb Shelter is about. This idea of how do you keep the people you love safe? What are the real threats in the world? What are the threats that we imagine? And also, once you've seen something horrible happen that people go, oh, that'll never happen. But once it does, how do you tell your brain it won't happen again?
Good question. I don't know. It was a crazy story. I mean, I can imagine it being very, it was one of those stranger danger things that, vast majority of kidnappings are, of course, like custodial cases and things like that. Right. But no, in that case, it was a pretty crazy story.
Yeah. So a lot of times I'm just writing about things that I can't stop thinking about. And people ask a lot of times, like, how do you remember details of things that happened in the past? For the stuff I write about, these are the stories that burned themselves into my brain. I'm not having to think very hard to remember because it's all right there. The stuff I can't remember, I don't end up writing about.
Exactly. And how do you revise? Like, so let's say you've got this, essay. I mean, presumably you've been crafting it and then you are then working on it more. I mean, do you have any particular process or tips that you figured out for that?
Revising is my favorite part because that's art. That's like, all right, now we're going to make it sound good and look good and be this fully engaging, entertaining experience that engages people's senses. That's great. That's so much easier, not easier because it's hard, but it's to me better than the part where I'm like, what is that? What am I trying to say? What is the story? I love revising. I save every version of an essay. So if I have a version that's 5,000 words long and I know I've got to get it down to 3,000 for some reason, like I'm, pitching it to a publication or whatever, I'll save the 5,000 word version and then I'll just hack away at it and I'll save that version. And then if I'm like, that wasn't quite it, I'll hack away at it in a different way because I never want to be shy about edits because I'm worried I can't get something back. I want to be bold with my edits and actually try, okay, what would it take to make this really good? What if I took the whole first page out? I don't want to not do that because I'm like, oh, but I might want the first page back. Just save it. It's over there. It's in what I have a document that I call Legos, where I take like little pieces of things I'm working, like a sentence that I'm like, this sentence is so great. It doesn't belong in this essay, but I'm going to use it somewhere. I toss it into the document called Legos. And it's like a big blocks. I can go in and pull it out later and build something else with it. So I try to save everything, save all the pieces so that I'm never shy about being bold with my edits. I love editing. It's the best part, when you can get in there and say, okay, now this paragraph is saying exactly what I mean for it to say. Now, how can I say it in a way that starts to sort of play with the reader a little bit? Like the chapter in Bomb Shelter where we find my son on the floor and we call 911. That's probably the piece I worked on longer and harder than anything else in the book, because what I wanted to do with it, in addition to telling you a story and making you understand why this me character was left in the state she was in and had all these questions to think about, I wanted you to feel what it was like to be there that morning so that you could really take this journey with me the rest of the book. I couldn't breathe that morning. I was breathless. So one of the things I did in the final rounds of editing that piece was adjust my sentence structure and my words and where I put the punctuation so that if you were reading it, you know how when you read, even if you're not reading out loud, it's kind of like you're reading in your brain, you would get short of breath. Like that's the level of editing that I love when I get to that part. And when I get to, okay, there are 3 different words that mean the same thing. Which one do I want for sound? Or which one do I like the look of it on the page? I love that stuff.
Yeah. No, it's always fun to turn something into something better.
Yes.
And it's a different process entirely than just creating something out of nothing.
Yes, totally.
I feel like the sculptor shaping, what's there.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's great. That's great. So does something big need to happen for there to be another memoir? Or are you planning on just...
That's a great question. I mean, I will say when I came home in 2019, when I came home from touring for I Miss You When I Blink, when I was at about this phase of the book cycle season, people kept asking me, what are you going to write next? And I was like, I got nothing. I don't have anything. I don't know what I'm going to write next. I have nothing to write about. And everything that is in Bomb Shelter, or at least everything that was in like the first half of Bomb Shelter, had already happened. It was right there. I mean, it was not forgotten. It was like recent. It was all right there, but I hadn't reached the point where I could start to see connective threads between the things that were happening. So it's entirely possible that in 6 months, I will wake up and go, oh my gosh, there's all this stuff that has happened since when I turned in Bomb Shelter, and I'm seeing connective threads, and I have something to say, and I have a question to ask, and I have something to engage readers with. I don't believe that you have to have monumental things happen to you in order to get to write a memoir. I think it's more important that you have a monumental question to answer and to grapple with. You can use everyday life to answer, monumental questions. Or in 6 months, I could be sitting here going, all right, I got to figure out how to do something else. I don't know.
I'm sure it'll come to you. I'm sure.
I hope so.
That's encouraging to hear, Mary Laura, because I always thought, if I were to write about my life is very boring. So I think it was,
Memoirs of Everyday Life are some of my favorite books because it's the question, the emotional core of a memoir. That's the part that's supposed to be relatable to people. So if you were writing a memoir about that time you got kidnapped and held hostage on a pirate ship, I've never been held hostage on a pirate ship. But if you wrote really well about what it feels like to think, I have no control of this situation, and you really made me feel that. I've had many situations in my life where I felt out of control and where I felt like other people are making the decisions for me and I have no options. And I would relate on that level. You can tackle that same theme. You can tackle all those same questions with a story about being 18 and feeling like you have no control over your life. And there's nothing exciting about it other than you go to high school every day. But the meat of it, the emotional core, is what makes it relatable.
Because I really don't want to get kidnapped on a pirate ship.
I don't want that to happen to you either.
Although speaking of exciting things, you recently interviewed somebody that is a fantastic interview. Tell us about meeting Dolly Parton.
I will. So it's so funny. Nashville is such an odd town. When I first moved here, people would say, "Oh, you live in Nashville now. You probably know so and so." They would name these. There are a lot of famous people who live here, and the fact is, I do know a lot of them. But just because this is where I live, and they live here also, and our kids go to school, and so Nashville's a weird kind of low key celebrity town. But Dolly Parton is the one, like mega mega star who I thought, well, I will never meet Dolly Parton, because who meets Dolly Parton? She doesn't just go to the grocery store. I'm not going to see her in the carpool line. But back toward the end of last year, I got a phone call, actually a text one day out of the blue that said, hey, I work with Parade Magazine, which is that little thing that comes out in some of the Sunday papers. And we're going to do a big feature on Dolly Parton and James Patterson because they are writing a novel together that comes out in the spring. And we need to know if you would be, it was really short notice. It was like, we need to know if you'd be available next week to come spend the day at Dolly's compound with them and like be there for their whole photo shoot together and sit down and talk to them. And it was so funny because I thought, this text does not need question marks. Like, yes, of course I'm going to come. I will cancel whatever else I'm doing. And so I got to go and sit with Dolly and Jim, who are like America's grandparents. They are both so smart. They are both so at the top of their game and such savvy business people who have built empires. And at the same time, they are both like roughly my parents' age. And, we're getting settled in our room to do the interview. And they're like, oh, I need a pillow for my back. And just hand me a Kleenex. It was so delightful in that they were both humanized. Like, there they are. They're just people. But at the same time, I did not leave thinking they were any less of the, huge stars they are. Like, I didn't walk out going, oh, Dolly, she's just like me. No, she's Dolly Parton. She's on a whole other level, but she's also, and this is wonderful, exactly how you imagine her. She fully embodies the character of Dolly Parton at all times.
That is awesome. That is awesome. All right. Well, Mary Laura, we always end with a love of the week. I am going to state mine first so that you can then do yours. I love your nook. It is gorgeously decorated. I have to say, I'm a big fan of doors. I've been thinking about doors this week because the chaos that is outside in my house is just like constant. And when I am in my recording space here, I have two doors between me and the outside world because this is an interior closet inside the home office. And I find that the more doors that are between me and other people, the harder it is for them to breach them. So I
love it.
Maybe when I'm older, I can have a nook in the hallway when my kids are older and grown up. But for the moment, I am barricaded in here.
Oh, that's fantastic. I mean, what is it they say? Like, tall fences make good neighbors, or good fences make good neighbors. Like, many doors make a good working
good home
mom.
Office, yes.
Okay, here's my love of the week. I recently started re-watching for the third time The West Wing, which is just my comfort show. But this time I'm watching it and listening to the podcast that I didn't listen to when it was originally on. I think it started back in 2017, hosted by Josh Malina, who was on the show, called The West Wing Weekly, where they go one episode at a time from the pilot all the way through the end. And they just analyze these episodes on a microscope level. And it is such an interesting masterclass in storytelling and directing and writing. They have Aaron Sorkin come in and speak. They have the actors and directors come in and speak. And it's almost like I feel like I'm kind of going to a little story school listening to the podcast. And then I sit down and I watch the episode, and it's just, it's like a big bowl of mac and cheese. It's so comforting. I love it. It makes me so happy.
Those of us who may have watched it the first time in the 90s or so, right, when I was out, yes, it was very much of the time.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Mary Laura, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it. Can you just tell our listeners where they can find you?
Thank you so much for having me, Laura. Yes, I have a website, marylauraphilpott.com, and that is where you can sign up for my newsletter, which I send maybe monthly. And I always give a book recommendation and then usually a link, a song, and some sort of fun picture. I'm on Instagram. Instagram and Twitter are probably the two I use the most. I do have a Facebook page. I started a TikTok, but then I lost my password and I abandoned it. So
the TikTok was where you were going to showcase Frank the turtle, right?
I thought about it and then I just lost steam. So Instagram, Twitter, and sign up for my newsletter and we can stay in touch.
Sounds good. All right. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks.
Well, that was a fun interview. Hope you guys enjoyed that. So today's question comes from a listener who wrote this specifically to Sarah, but we can both chime in a little bit on here. She says, how old were your children when you started becoming intentional about planning and tracking your time. We'll call this listener T in case somebody wants to find the question from T as they are searching here. The context is that T has a 4-year-old and a 5-month-old. She was doing well using her planner and sometimes a bullet journal before her second child was born. Now she finds herself feeling more at peace with all the work, and she found herself then feeling at peace with all the things she had going on. But now, as she has her second kid, she hasn't managed to get back into a routine after the baby. She works at home and I'm constantly forgetting kid things, work things, me things, you name it. She said, I used to love planning in the mornings before the rest of the house was awake. Now I roll out of bed at 5:45 a.m. with the baby and can't stop to think. I would love to get back into it, but I don't feel like sitting down with my planner if I know the baby is going to scream in 2 minutes or my son is going to run downstairs to try to scribble in my planner. So, Sarah, planning with little kids.
So hard. And I know exactly that impulse you mean where you're like, if I could just get like a moment in the morning to just sit there and lay out my day, everything would be better. But you just can't get that moment because you're tired and your kids are waking you up and it just feels insurmountable. It will get better. I promise it will get better. Every single time I had a baby, I switched from my more elaborate daily planner to a weekly planner and wrote a lot less in there because my brain just couldn't handle it and I was too tired and there just wasn't the bandwidth. And you're right, your kids might, well, hopefully your 4.5-year-old would know better. If Genevieve scribbled, she knows, like she wouldn't even dare scribble in my planner. I shouldn't tempt fate, but I don't know, make sure they understand how incredibly important that is to you. And hopefully that wouldn't happen. But in terms of the actual bandwidth issue and the fatigue and the just not having peace to do it when you have the energy to do it, I totally understand. And I just think you're normal. And in a year or so, when your kids are sleeping more normally, more regularly, when you're not up through the night and when you can kind of count on a more consistent wake up time, I know you will have your planning mojo back. I guess the one other thing I'll mention is that if it's super important to you to have a little morning planning session, see if your partner could certain days per week perhaps cover you, even if it's from like 5:45 to 6 a.m. Although again, I bet you're nursing and I bet your baby just wakes up and they just want you. And that's why it's like, it's frustrating. But see if there's anything you could do to get that little bit of morning coverage if it would help you to feel a little bit more centered to lay out your day. But don't feel bad if you can't.
Yeah. Although I say if she is nursing first thing in the morning, I found, in the time that the kid was on the left side, so I could use my right hand, I could do stuff like write in a planner or type. So, yeah. And the kid is quiet then, right? Like that's the time that you might actually be able to do something because they're not requiring you to interact with them because they're busy eating. So just throwing that out there as an idea. One-handed typing or writing. Your handwriting will not be the best in the world, but so what? I think when you're kids this age, it's about functional planning, not on the, you don't need to worry about the washi tape and the little multicolored dots or whatever it is you guys do. I don't know. She asked you and she said planning. So I assume she mostly means planning, but since she used the word tracking, I want to throw out here that I started tracking my time in April of 2015, which was when Alex was 3 months old. He's now 7.5. So that means that I did track time through my 2 youngest kids' babyhoods, but I think somewhat differently from planning. Like tracking is just a pretty rote activity. Like I just check in 3 times a day and write down what I did since the last time I checked in. So it's literally a 3-minute process per day that is done in 1-minute chunks. So if you are interested in tracking your time, and I think it's actually a really kind of cool way to see things like how much am I sleeping? When is the baby waking up? When am I feeding him? How many times per day? And to have that memory as well of your kids' young years, you might try doing that. I'm going to throw that out there as something that might be more feasible than maybe intense planning. But as for planning, I mean, I would also, with Sarah, say you might want to like dial down expectations a little bit and try to plan, 10 to 15 minutes on Friday for the upcoming week, maybe 5 minutes at the end of each workday to plan the next day. Don't worry about making it elaborate, just do a little bit. And often even a little bit can keep things from being chaotic. Yes. All right. Well, this has been Best of Both Worlds. I was interviewing Mary Laura Philpott. We will be back next week with more on making work and life fit together.
Thanks for listening. You can find me, Sarah, at theshoebox.com or at @the_shoebox on Instagram.
And you can find me, Laura, at lauravanderkam.com. This has been the Best of Both Worlds podcast. Please join us next time for more on making work and life work together.